All right, I'm Christian. Nice to meet you all. Together with my team, I run a company called Customlytics. We do the app doctors in the very back of the hallway. Some of you might have seen already. And I was asked to talk about incrementality today. And it's a very interesting topic, close to kind of our heart as like former performance marketing people. And incrementality is, if you want to put it like this, the opposite of cannibalization in your primarily user acquisition campaigns, and it goes back to the question of why would you pay for something that is already yours? And the reason why I put this question as one of the first slides is that and that happens in some companies, if you don't think about this question or don't kind of try to figure out what incrementality is all about, you can end up doing marketing with basically having very little to no impact, although you still think you have some impact, and this is exactly what incrementality is about. It's about finding out what your campaigns do, and that is primarily via comparing it to a time where you don't do any campaigns. So for the sake of the presentation, I will introduce a little persona that we will use. No affiliation with a real person whatsoever. So please meet George. This is him. And we will use George as a little persona to guide us through this talk, because then things get much more easier. So George is a paid user acquisition manager for a big and known retail app. The app already has a significant user base with millions of daily active users. So a lot of users in the app already. And it's a popular brand, meaning that even without George doing any user acquisition campaigns, there's a steady influx of organic installs coming into the app anyways. Because George is smart, that's actually the second one. Because George is smart, he uses a third-party tracking tool like Adjust, AppsFlyer, Branch, or Kochava to measure all his campaigns so that everything is tracked and everybody knows what's going on. But also because George is a simple guy, he tries to keep things basic, meaning that his user acquisition campaigns, his media mix is basically only 3 channels. It's Facebook, Google UAC, and Apple search ads. So this is the places where he runs campaigns at. And the question this is the reporting that George is looking at every day. Completely made up figures, of course, same as with George. So this is the reporting he looks at. For all the campaigns he does, he gets some basic information like, okay, how many impressions did happen, how many clicks did I get from this and that source, and how many installs did happen. And obviously he's also tracking user behavior in the app. He knows that some users are converting from his website, which is still there, where he has put a nice little smart banner. And then, of course, there's a big chunk of organic installs coming to his app because, as I said, it's a popular retail app. And now the question the problem that George has is he wants to understand the real impact of his user acquisition campaigns. So he has some figures in his tracking dashboard today, but he really wants to understand what is the net effect of him doing any of the user acquisition campaigns, both in a positive and negative way. So we'll quickly talk about the different ways on how doing user acquisition campaigns can have positive and negative impacts on your organic installs, where organic, for the sake of this presentation, is just the installs that are not tracked, that are coming from the store directly. So possible positive impacts is that George does this super nice ad campaign on Facebook for Windows 98, and users see it, but they don't click on it. And then the user goes to the website, purchases, and this would not be attributed to George's nice app install campaign. That's just one of the possible impacts. There are positive impacts, there are more than that. And that would essentially, although it's not tracked, that would have a positive impact on George's organic install baseline, because he would have another sale generated by the campaign, but not tracked. Possible negative impacts is, and I didn't find any better image than that, positive negative impacts is that networks that he uses for advertising are claiming installs that would have happened anyways organically, so people that would have installed the app anyways. And for several reasons, it can happen that your advertising network or advertising partner is claiming installs that would have happened anyways because they think or they say there was a click for it or they just hands down fake it. So there are also possible negative impacts of running a user acquisition campaign as it eats into your kind of organic installs. So next up, yeah. The emoji is broken, but doesn't matter. So in the following slides, I will quickly explain the solution that George has found to his problem, and it's called the incrementality test. It's a test that is designed to figure out what, again, the net effect of all your campaigns or like any given campaign is on your installs. It's the only approach that is kind of around there to measure that after all, so it's not like there would be some, 5 other nice solutions that you can try. And what we want to end up with is something like a multiplier or a factor that George can apply to the figures that he gets in the reporting to really know for each of the different channels in a kind of normalized way to know what the actual impact of the channels was, because there will be channels that are eating more into your organic installs and there will be channels that are eating less into your organic installs. And with the incrementality test that George is going to do now, we're going to figure out exactly that. This is a nice little graph that explains what I was kind of just explaining in words already. So there are 3 different scenarios possible for running a user acquisition, in this case, app install campaign. So starting with the middle one, it can have no impact on your organics whatsoever. So the amount of organic installs your app is getting stays the same as before, and the paid installs come on top of that. No effect on the organic installs whatsoever. That would be, if you want to put it like this, the neutral scenario. And then there are 2 more scenarios that can happen. And by the way, it's very, very rare. Basically, it doesn't happen a lot. And then there are 2 other scenarios. So the left scenario is, and that's actually even more uncommon than the middle one. The left scenario is that you are doing paid campaigns, and because of side effects that come from the paid installs, you're actually getting more organic installs than before. This is a possible positive impact. The Captain Obvious there is if you are doing shitloads of installs all of a sudden and then you rank up in the store, then you also get more organic installs from people finding you in the store. This is then the left scenario. And then there's the right scenario, which is kind of that's kind of the problem or the reason why we look at incrementality. The right scenario is that you do a campaign, the campaign attributes some number of installs to it, but then your overall organic installs actually go down, because there is stuff that's kind of falsely claimed to the campaign. And then George is like, okay, so what can I do about this? Incrementality test, nice, I want to run it, but there's more problems with that. The problem is that in user acquisition, different to retargeting, it's very hard to control your audiences. Because if you think about user acquisition, it's a bit like you out in the wild trying to get as many users from wherever possible. Whereas with retargeting, it's pretty easy to split your audience into 2 and then run different control tests. That's very difficult with user acquisition. There are 3 ways that are kind of recommendable to do it for UA. And the possible test scenarios are, and that's what they all have in common, you have to look for mutual exclusivity. So there are only 3 kind of methods to really do it in a more or less proper way. So the first one is time. This is by far the easiest method to do it. It's basically 1 week you do a campaign, next week or maybe like 2 weeks later you don't do the campaign anymore, and then you compare your organic baseline, hoping that there are no other huge external factors that have an impact on your organic installs. That's exactly the point. It's the easiest way, but it's also the one that can be biased easily because of seasonality. So if you do that, if you're in a retail app and you do that around Black Friday, then big surprise, the results will be flawed. The second option, which is also not perfect, which by the way, none of the options is perfect, is geolocation. You can go there and basically run 2 different cities, very difficult, countries is easier, that show a kind of similar user behavior against each other at the same time. The thing is, it's hard to find 2 places that where the users behave exactly the same. And then the last one is ID, as in you can go there and say, All right, so that only works really with like programmatic sources. You go there and say, okay, all users that have an advertising identifier starting with A to N go to this group, and all the rest goes to the other group. Yeah, that also has problems, as in you have to find a partner that can actually do it. So George then decides on the kind of easiest test setup that was outlined before, which is time segmentation. So remember, George had those three kind of media sources, and he decides to run time segmentation incrementality test, meaning that he pauses all campaigns, and then he has only one paid campaign running, and for those kind of time frames, he compares the organic baseline and the stuff that was attributed to the campaigns. Again, three possible scenarios, and this is the point we have to drink something. Three possible scenarios. To that, it can have a positive impact on organic installs, no impact, or a negative impact. And that is basically between time period 1 and 2, talking about the organic installs. So that leads us to the kind of the underlying question of incrementality, which is what's the real value of an install? So the value of an install is typically measured by the amount of money it costs, which is the cost per install, which is, by the way, not a very nice metric. But this is what George has from his reporting. So George is tracking with his attribution tool, he's tracking the different sources, and he knows that, for example, Facebook has a 5 euro CPI, Google Ads has a 4 euro CPI, and Search Ads is pretty cheap with 2 euro. This is what he pays, this is what he kind of gets based on the installs that are attributed to the campaigns. And now with the incrementality test, we are looking for that multiplier to multiply those CPIs with to get to the real, like the actual CPI, which is like cleaned up by the effect that the campaign has on the organic installs. Meaning that it gets a bit mathematical now. So the way it looks like is, or what we look at is, we will look at the uplift of the overall installs from time period 2, which is when, in this case, we will talk about Facebook, but George does it for all the campaigns. So time period 1 is no paid campaigns whatsoever. Time period 2 is he has Facebook running. So the uplift is defined as in overall installs from time period 2 minus the overall installs from time period 1, which supposedly should be exactly the amount of Facebook installs. And then the animation is broken, doesn't matter. And that is what we that is what we then put there. And we will put the actual installs that were attributed to the source. Yeah, better take pictures. Put the actual installs that were attributed to the source there, and then divide this by the uplift that we saw in the installs. Meaning that if we do this for a campaign that has no impact on organics, then we would have time period 1 has 100 organic installs, time period 2 has 100 organic installs, and Facebook is generating 50 on top. Then there will be 50 attributed installs, and 50 installs in the uplift equals 1. So we will not do anything about the CPI. This is like no effect whatsoever. If there are more installs attributed than we see uplift, then it eats into organic, and then the multiplier will be higher than 1, and vice versa. So that means George gets to testing. Again, keep in mind his media mix, Facebook, Google Ads, Search Ads. And because he has so many different sources, his actual test setup looks like this. So there's week 1 where we pause all campaigns, and then there's week 2 where only Facebook is running. Facebook is paused. Week 3, we only do Google UAC. Is paused again. Week 4, we will do Search Ads, and that's the end of the experiment. Now, this is a easy way of displaying it. In reality, the time frames probably be longer, and we probably wait some time in between. But for the sake of the presentation, this is how George is doing it. And then George applies the calculation that we've seen on the slide before. Now, on the left side, in the CPI column, you see the CPIs that George is actually paying to the network. So this is what is coming out of his reporting. This is based on the attributed installs by the campaign. And then the incremental multiplier shows that in the case of Facebook, the campaign actually has a positive impact on organic installs, meaning more organic installs are generated in the time frame where Facebook is running, than in the time frame where Facebook was not running. That means, and that's kind of 20%. So that means that the effective CPI, because George is getting kind of 0.2 additional installs with every Facebook install, is actually lower than the money he's paying. While Google UAC and Apple search ads are effectively in this example, are effectively eating into his organics, meaning that the effective CPI goes up because actually he's paying more for an install than what his reporting says. And then all of a sudden, where before George was probably optimizing towards the cheaper channels and would go there and say, okay, if all the users are equal, then obviously I would buy more on Apple search ads for €2 than for €5 on Facebook. Now all of a sudden that has changed, and the cheapest effective CPI is actually Facebook, although on paper and in his previous reporting it had the highest CPI. So this is a basic incrementality test. And this is how you can do it with your UA campaigns. So George is finally happy. But there's one more question that we can, or that we should discuss now. And that is the question of, okay, is all this kind of, are all the sources that are overly claiming organic installs are already fraud? Well, the answer is it's hard to tell, and the line is probably not that clear. So definitely there will be sources that, especially like some funny networks, that you do that just have fraudulent mechanics going on, and that will just spam clicks, and then your organics will go down, and there will be no net effect of the campaign whatsoever. It will just eat into your organics. And then there's kind of everything in between that and the perfect campaign that's actually generating additional organic installs. And the line there is always hard to draw. However, if you go back to this table right here with the incremental multiplier, you can kind of yourself actually calculate the point where you say, okay, for this effective CPI, I'm not going to buy any more traffic from this source. So I guess that's incrementality in a nutshell. Of course, we have time for questions now. And yeah, happy to take 1, 2, 3 questions, if you like. Anyone? Yes.
How would you suggest running these tests with a marketing that is already at scale? So if you're like already spending $1 million plus a month, you cannot just pause things down for a month.
It's very difficult. There you can great answer, by the way. There you can revert to one of the other methods. The time one will probably not be the one you go for. I know, like, every now and then there is an example of a company with marketing at scale actually going crazy and doing this with like pause everything. But that is then more because at this point with like 10 different networks they have no clue anymore who's like getting which attribution whatsoever. But you're right, with like marketing at scale, like the time stuff probably won't work that well. So yeah, this is where it gets more difficult. And you probably want to revert to one of the other methods, or do it in a very small scale, as in if it's a global product, you find some 2 countries that are pretty smallish, and if it's all online, then you might have a chance to pause everything there without your company going like off-road, and then do the test there. But you are right, the more marketing channels you have, the more marketing spend you have, the more difficult it gets. Other questions? Very good. And one last disclaimer, of course, all stories named the characters portrayed in this were completely fictional. And I think the only thing to end it is that if you want to be like George, then you can drop us a line and we can talk in greater detail about incrementality.